Hi, I'm James McGuire, and on today's eSpeaks, we're talking about the enterprise network, which is really the foundation of everything in IT, from cloud to AI to automation. The entire structure of the enterprise is shaped by the network. To find out what's up with the network today and where it's headed, I'm joined by Zeus Kerravala, industry analyst and founder of ZK Research. Zeus, very good to have you with us today.
Yeah, and eWEEK contributor, don't forget that.
Yeah, that's a very big part of it because obviously you often write for the publication. I look forward to your articles coming over, and we post a lot of them. Some very cool stuff.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's an interesting time in networking. I've been an industry analyst 20 years. Before that, I was actually a CIO. I worked at a VAR. I was a network engineer, and I have never seen this much interest in network modernization, and not just from the network engineers, but all the way up to C-level executives. In fact, this year I ran a survey and I asked business leaders if the pandemic changed their view of the network, and I think it was 2/3 said they view it as more important now. So that's been, historically the network team has been those people in the basement that nobody ever talked to.
Right.
You became a network engineer because you didn't like working with people, but they're core to businesses now. And if you think about this big shift to digital transformation, right? That we read about a lot. All the digital technologies are cloud and mobile and IoT and AI. They're all network centric in nature.
Of course, right.
And so the network itself has become the foundation for digital businesses, and that's a whole new role for the network. And frankly, as someone who's been covering this technology for a long time, it's pretty exciting now. There's a lot more interest in it than there ever has been before.
Well, what really amazes me about the network sector is that it is particularly complicated, and that I think all the sectors, cloud, artificial intelligence, IoT, they all have their subsectors, and they have. If you get down to the weeds, you get pretty complicated. But networking feels like it's got so many little sub areas, like wide area networks and local area networks and software defined networking, and then network security, and of course IoT and edge is really a network play. So it's like when you talk about networking, we're talking about a lot going on. I love it if you give us kind of like what's going on in 2022, either like one trend, what's really big with the network these days.
Yeah, well, there's not one trend, and you're right. There are these
Of course.
subsectors, but what's interesting is, though, to deliver a great experience, all those sub networks have to act as one network.
Mm-hmm.
That actually itself has been a pretty interesting trend. Is how do you create observability across the end-to-end network? Because when a user says, my Zoom's not working, it does. You got to be able to drill down on that and find out where that is and why that is.
Right.
And you also mentioned network security, and that's interesting too, because a lot of end-to-end data analytics are now being used to be able to infer security breaches versus the old signature-based model where you could only find things that you knew about, right? So the data that the network's giving off is playing a really important role in both monitoring user performance, but also in security.
Well, a couple of them. I mean, you mentioned observability. I'd like to ask you about that. It seems like observability, I've heard more about that in the last 2 or 3 years. It seems like it's come from almost nowhere to be a really big, almost like the trend du jour. Agree, disagree on that? And what about zero trust? It's like zero trust is big in the networking world as well.
Yeah, observability has unfortunately become one of those overused terms, where it means everything to everybody, and when that happens, it means nothing to anybody.
Right.
But I do think the ability to look across whatever domain you own, it might just be Wi-Fi, it could be the whole network, it could be applications, be able to see what's going on and then be able to infer or create a lot of insights from it, right? So there's the old adage that you can't manage or you can't secure what you can't see.
Right.
And so what observability does, it's the foundation, is let me see more in a more granular way. And one of the reasons, James, that you have heard more about it is the telemetry that networks give off today is much richer than before. Like if you go back 5 years ago, SNMP was really the primary type of observability tool you had, and that was a sampling technology. So you polled the network every 30 seconds, and that would create a lot of gaps in data, right? Because something might happen for 2 seconds, you won't see it. All the telemetry coming off all the major network vendors today, it's all real time, right? And so now you can get to this world where I can have very granular telemetry.
Not limited to a beep every 30 seconds, fortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And part of that is just network processors are more, they're more efficient today. So we're not. I remember in the old when I was a router jockey, if you had turned debug on, you would actually bring your router to its knees. The thing couldn't process information fast enough. That's, there's more memory, more processing, there's GPUs, so we have a lot more compute available to make our networks better. And you mentioned zero trust. Zero trust to me is fascinating because it actually flips the whole model of the network upside down from a security perspective. So the original internet was designed with the concept that everything could talk to everything.
Right.
And that's why it works so well. If I type google.com in my browser and like less than a second, I'm connected to it, even though that site might be on the other side of the world, right? It's
sure.
When you think about how fast it is, it's remarkable. Now, the downside of everything can talk to everything is that once I breach the network, I can talk to everything.
Right. I mean, it's kind of a
find
utopian vision that it's going to be okay for everything to talk to everything, because we can't really live that way in the real world.
Yeah, and it becomes asymmetrically more complicated for network pros in that when you had one entry point, I could protect it. But now that I have all these different entry points, the bad guys just have to find one way in and they have access to everything. So zero trust flips that model around and says nothing can talk to anything unless explicitly allowed. And so if in fact, there was a famous retailer that was breached a few years ago through its HVAC system, and not just its HVAC system, its HVAC contractor, right, was breached. That created a backdoor into the HVAC system, which was connected to the same network the point of sale was on, and it created a backdoor. If zero trust had been used at that time, then all those different networks would have been isolated. And then the worst thing that would have happened is maybe they would have turned up the temperature in the stores or something like that.
Right.
And so what zero trust does is by limiting access to things that are only explicitly allowed, you minimize the blast radius of the breach. And that's been something companies have tried to do with segmentation and VLANs and things like that. And the reason those didn't work, James, is because they were tied to network ports or IP addresses. And so if I could set everything up initially, and then I picked up an IoT device and moved it to a different segment, I'd have to reprogram the network to tell it where that new device is. Zero trust works almost as an overlay to the physical network. And so the policies follow the device or the user, thereby in a highly dynamic environment, which most businesses are today, right? Zero trust is able to maintain those policies without having to do any kind of reconfiguration.
And then there's the idea of cloud networking, which I'd like to ask you about. But first, educate me, if you will. I've always wondered this, and I'm glad to have a network specialist in front of me. I can ask this sort of a dumb question. So, say there's a company in Dubuque, Iowa, and they work with AWS, and say the data center they connect with is in the Northwest, or maybe it's probably not local. What is the network infrastructure they're connecting with that remote cloud provider? It's not simply the internet, is it?
Well, it can be a number of things. It could be the internet. You can get direct connectivity from all the cloud providers as well.
What is that? Is that like a fat pipe that could somehow actually go to your business? How does that physically work?
Well, if you're a big retailer, or you're pushing lots of data over it or something like that, or big logistics company, you probably do have a big fat pipe. You can get dedicated virtual pipes that go over the network, or you can just use the plain internet. There's really no you can run your own fiber to the cloud provider. Some companies will actually build their data centers close to the cloud providers' data centers to minimize that latency. And so however you want to, that's the great thing with the cloud, is however you want to architect, you can. Now, the thing with cloud networking, and I want to make sure people understand this, is just because the vendor throws cloud in front of the product doesn't mean it's cloud networking.
Right.
Cloud managed is different than cloud networking. And so with a lot of the network vendors now have moved their management control plane to the cloud, and that's great. I can manage to the cloud. There's a lot of benefits to that, but cloud networking is actually allowing me to interconnect my business to the cloud, and then also the instances within the cloud to each other. And increasingly it will be within cloud providers itself as companies go multi-cloud and edge. And that actually creates an interesting opportunity for startups and the other network vendors. And that if I use like AWS Transit Gateway, that does a great job of connecting my AWS instances within AWS. But if I then want to connect to Azure or GCP, Transit Gateway doesn't do that,
Mhm.
right? And so what we almost need now is and there are some startups trying to do this, is an independent third-party vendor that actually can kind of act as the Rosetta Stone
Mhm.
to, for cloud networking and allow me to connect to Azure when I need to, GCP when I need to, AWS when I need to, and then also to all these edge services that are coming. And the interesting thing about edge is there's not one definition of edge. We have
Right.
telco edge, IoT edge, enterprise edge, cloud edge, right? 5G edge. Any location you can think of that's not central has an edge to it, and that creates a much more complicated network. And so even if I try and use, one vendor, AWS, for their environment and Azure for another, as my environment grows, I'll never be able to manage policies and security across those using independent tools.
Well, the thing is, in other words, in our current day, if someone has a multi-cloud setup and they're with AWS and with GCP, they of course got a network between the home base and the remote cloud instance separately for say Amazon and GCP, correct? They can't. There
Yeah,
is no
well, that's
third
because
party router, so to speak.
we don't really do multi-cloud today. What most companies think of as multi-cloud is multiple clouds, and then I
Right.
use AWS for this app, and then Azure for this workload. But I'm not actually trying to move data between those cloud providers. I think the future is though, and if you look in the consumer space, it's already that way. An app like Waze pulls, location information from Google and pulls, other information from Apple and things like that. And so it's using multiple sources of data from multiple cloud providers to create a single app. I think that's the future of enterprise application development. And we do need real multi-cloud then, but I'd contend what we have today is multiple clouds, which isn't multi-cloud.
Well, I think it seems to be a common thought in the industry that you're not going to really migrate applications between your various cloud vendors. If it's set up with Azure, it's set up with Azure, you're not going to suddenly click a button and make it go to GCP. So there is a sort of a siloed world between the cloud vendors. Almost, I mean, the cloud vendors almost support that idea themselves because they're competing with each other.
Yeah, well, you might move the data though. That's the thing, is I might want to pull data from one to another to build an application. And that's where I wish I would like to see the cloud vendors actually work together to create better interoperability. And it's been proven over time, when you make things interoperable, the adoption of it grows, right? Like, remember the old mobile phone days where if I was on Verizon, I couldn't, call on the Sprint network and, all these off net, on net things like that. And as soon as they got rid of all that, everybody's got one, right?
Well, isn't that what the snowflakes of the world are doing? And that they claim they're cloud agnostic and they're moving data around. So that helps
Yeah,
that cross data
they're trying
world.
to from a data perspective, but then we got to think about it from containers and virtual machines, and there's a lot of layers of the stack that need to be included. So that's why that network layer becomes important, because it always becomes Switzerland to whatever's above it.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. What about the world of wireless 5G versus Wi-Fi 6 and 6E? Explain this one to me. What's going on in that world? I'm not even totally absolutely on board with 5G yet, but tell me about Wi-Fi 6 and 6E.
Yeah, I love this question because it's completely alphabet soup, and nobody, 5G and Wi-Fi 6, and it's very confusing, right? It's like, why is it one of 6 and one of 5? And then you also have private 5G, which is
Great.
CBRS, right? And so
Sure.
they're all viable wireless technologies. I do think, your traditional carpeted office with in-building connectivity, Wi-Fi is fine. And I think the difference between Wi-Fi 6 and 6E is, with 6E we have it's no longer 5 gigahertz spectrum, it's 6 gigahertz, and so it doesn't 5 gigahertz competes with microwaves and a whole bunch of other things, and so you get a lot of interference. There's a lot of old devices on it as well, where 6 gigahertz is a whole new spectrum, and it's clean, and it's like having a whole new road system built for you.
Hmm.
And I was at Chase Center with the Warriors playing, and I was talking to the VP of IT there, and they were doing their own tests. They're getting a gig up and down on Wi-Fi 6E, and only about
Which
100.
is considered fast, correct?
Oh, a gig, yeah.
Yeah.
And compared to Wi-Fi 6, where it's only about 160 meg. So if you're, Instagramming and FaceTiming and tweeting and stuff like that, and think about all the stuff we do today on our phones, all the
Mhm.
content we create. that increase in speed's a big deal. Now, I think where I see a lot of 5G being used is in private 5G certainly are for instances where I need high speed connectivity, but I must have reliable connectivity. And so while Wi-Fi is really flexible, it works across a range of devices.
Mhm.
We've all used Wi-Fi, James, where we're sitting in an airport and we're watching a
Sure.
movie, and then everybody comes to the gate and it no longer works, right?
Right.
And right, and we find that frustrating. With 5G, you get dedicated bandwidth. Well, you get a lot more reliable bandwidth, I suppose, is a better way to describe it. But it's more expensive to deploy, right?
Mhm.
And because you got to worry about licenses and spectrum allocation and things like that. And so I was talking with one of the sports teams. They're now using private 5G as a way of doing facial recognition for ticketing. And so that's a service that can't go down, right? And
Right.
so, even though the speed was comparable, the fact that it's much more reliable, makes 5G, more compelling. And that's why you see it used in factory floors for robots, autonomous vehicles,
Mhm.
things like that. So from an enterprise perspective, if you have for your general connectivity, don't overinvest in 5G. Wi-Fi is fine, right? If I want to buy a 5G enabled laptop, I'm looking at $2,000 minimum. If I can buy a Chromebook for $200,
Oh,
right? So
so you're saying don't get caught up in the hype of 5G, although in
don't get
reality, though, doesn't the consumer want to be ready for the next few years if they buy something now?
well, the consumer does, right? So and so public 5G and in building 5G for businesses are different.
Right.
And use Wi-Fi for your general purpose connectivity, and those areas where you have mission critical connectivity, for hospitals, that's patient equipment for,
Mhm.
like I said, factory floors. I talked to one company that's looking to deploy 5G enabled cleaning robots to go around and sanitize the building as people come to work,
Mhm.
right? Facial recognition, security cameras, things like that. Those are all ideal use cases for 5G. So you'll deploy Wi-Fi and 6 or 6E, and then you'll augment it with 5G or private 5G where needed. And I like private 5G just because it gives the enterprise a lot more control over the data. Where if I go get it from one of the 5G providers, they own the data, not me.
Mhm. All right, let's talk about AI ops and automation. And since we're close to AI here, I want to make sure when we talk about this, we have to somehow mention Chat GPT because it's what what's everyone talking about this week. It's like that big topic. Um, Networking and AI ops and automation. Your thoughts, yes? Where are we going with this one?
Yeah, that's I see. I think AI is the future. Apps is the future in networking, right?
Mhm.
And automation. I and I have to confess, when I was a network engineer, I was a pretty hardcore. I can do things manually faster than anybody type of guy.
Oh, you
And
you believe that? Okay,
oh
good.
yeah, well I proved that I could script and things faster than the cows came home, right? So, but
Right.
I also wasn't dealing with the complexity that networks have today or the volume of data that you
Right.
have today. And so even the most seasoned engineers, I don't think can work fast enough anymore to keep
Mhm.
up with all the changes going on. And the other aspect of it is, look, I made a lot of errors, fat fingering things, and human error still accounts for the number one cause of unplanned downtime. So we
Mm.
started off this segment saying networks are more important than ever. Well, if that's the case, then I need to remove all that unplanned downtime caused by human error, and to do that by AI. Now, the argument against AI is we're early in the cycle, and a lot of times AI engines make mistakes, right? They're still going through the learning process. So
Mm.
you look at an AI and it tries to identify a cat versus a dog. Sometimes it'll say it's a dog.
Right.
It gets better over time. And for the IT pros that I talk to, I caution them not to wait for perfection. The threshold to entry is better than people, right?
Right, which we've probably reached that threshold already.
And we've long surpassed it. It's a little bit like when people freak out when a Tesla has an accident. Well, it has one accident every 2 million miles versus
Right.
people, which is one accident every 100,000 miles, right? So,
Sure. Right.
and Teslas have gone from 500,000 miles to a million to 2 million. It'll probably be 4 million down the road, right? So it gets exponentially better, where people at best can get linearly better. But I'd
Right.
argue volume of data coming, if you can just stay flat, that's a win. And so I think the only way to really survive here is through AI. And look, the other part of this is just for your own personal growth. I tell engineers this all the time. If you're doing things today that aren't strategic to your resume, don't do them anymore. Find a
Mm.
way to use AI to automate them out of your job, because no
Mhm.
one's going to hire you because you can configure VLANs and upload iOS and and things like that. So for your own job and skill set perspective,
Mhm.
find a way to use AI to remove the mundane things that bog you down so you can do more advanced things.
Interesting. This sounds like a great piece of advice.
Yeah.
To wrap up, I'd like to get your sense of just something we need to know, a big idea, either the future or something that's really important, a core idea. When you wake up in the morning, you're thinking about networking. What's big right now that people need to know about?
Yeah, I think I'm finally seeing the integration of networking and security come together, right? And this is something that gosh, as an analyst, James, I've been writing about for the better part of 20 years. And
Yeah.
it's never really happened before. And that's because those two domains lived independently.
Really, you're saying that networking and security have never really, meshed before about now?
Well, with large enterprises, you have security teams and network teams, and never the two should meet. In fact,
Gotcha.
if you look at the big security vendors, right, the Fortinets and Palo Altos, and they have very small security practices or network practices. And if you look at companies like Cisco and Juniper and Arista, they have very small security practices. So you're either Cisco might be the only one that kind of is big in both, but Cisco largely sells a lot of security because it's of their brand.
Right.
But I think over time, what work from home has done is it's created the need. It's not just work from home. There's actually a lot of factors at play, but with work from home, I have to be able to get corporate grade security everywhere a user is, and so that almost mandates that it's somehow embedded in the network. But more importantly, I think the threat actors have gotten so good and so advanced today that, and remember I said that security used to be signature based, right? Well, the bad guys know that too. So I'm just going to create something there's no signature for.
Mhm.
And so what network information can tell you is it can find even the smallest anomalies that can indicate a breach. So for instance, a lot of IoT devices, you take like a connected printer, right? It's going to report back to HP or Epson or whatever what toner volume is that at the end of the day,
Mhm.
right? And so it sends a very little bit of information every day. If all of a sudden it's sending volumes of information to your accounting server, right? Well, even a little bit of information in your accounting server, well, that warrants further investigation. It could be that, and even with most users, I bet your activities on a day-by-day basis don't change a whole lot, right?
Mhm.
And so all of a sudden, if you start logging in from another country and using different applications within the company, that indicates that something's amiss. And maybe your job changed and that's the way it should be, but at
Mhm.
least it's an indicator that it requires further investigation. And so I think it's not, a matter of firewalls need to be network based. I think it's network telemetry is your first and best indicator for a breach,
Mhm.
right? And that I think is the big change that's going on that really drives us to bring these two areas together.
Yes, that's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise today. A lot of great stuff. I learned a lot, and please come back and talk with us again sometime.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on eSpeaks. It's always a pleasure to be on eWEEK.